Hi there. Tonight we travel back to an era of corsets, carriages and chamber pot, where even the most refined ladies had to contend with the eternal human question. How do you wipe with dignity when lace and layers are in the way? You find yourself standing in a Victorian drawing room, deep green wallpaper, thick velvet drapes, and the persistent tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. The room smells faintly of lavender and coal smoke. Somewhere upstairs, a maid is lighting the gas lamps, but your focus is not on the parlour, it's on the privy tucked beyond the hedge, just past the roses. Because in this prim, proper age of stiff collars and stiffer manners, no one talks about the very thing everyone must do, defecation, and, more precisely, wiping afterward. It's a bodily truth that no lace cuff or fancy fan can cover up for long. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy tonight, leave a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where you all tune in from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a well-to-do London household. The year is 1862 and you have the misfortune of needing the toilet right after dinner. You excuse yourself, adjust your bodice, and slip through the servants' corridor into the chilly garden. Out here, things are quieter, save for the crunch of gravel beneath your boots and the creak of the privy door as it swings inward. The outhouse is made of dark wood, smells faintly of mildew and ash, and there's a wax candle stub mounted to the inside wall. You sit carefully on the wooden seat, grateful that someone laid down a fresh cloth to take the edge off the splinters. The air is cold against your ankles. And now comes the moment. The part we never talk about. There, beside you, hangs a modest little bundle of used newspaper cut into squares and skewered onto a nail. If you're lucky, it's today's illustrated London news, but more likely it's last week's shipping notices. Ink smudges your fingers as you tear off a square. You wipe delicately. No one in society will teach you how. It's a skill, quietly passed down through repetition and whispered hints from elder sisters. Too rough and you'll irritate delicate skin. Too little and you'll regret it the moment you sit down for tea. Historians still argue whether most upper-class households relied entirely on newspaper or reserved fine cloths for more intimate use. Some diaries hint at linen squares laundered daily by housemaids, while others mention boudoir tissues, a euphemism so fragile it's practically embroidered. One quirky anecdote? In some homes, sewing baskets included a special compartment for wiping cloths, neatly hemmed, labelled, and occasionally monogrammed. These were discreet, reusable, and burned when frayed beyond repair. You fold your square of newsprint carefully, yes, folding is the proper thing, and drop it into a lidded tin below the seat. No flushing, no handles, just gravity and embarrassment. Someone will empty it later, likely Thomas the footman, who tries to avoid eye contact for an entire week after. You tug your skirts back down, press open the door, and breathe in the damp garden air. Even in the world of lace gloves and calling cards, you are still human, still wiping, still hoping you didn't sit on a splinter, and back inside the gas-lit home as you rejoin polite society with your posture flawless and your secrets intact. You can't help but think this might be a golden age of invention, manners, and moral restraint. But when it comes to that, you're still wiping with last Tuesday's obituaries. You don't dare say it aloud, of course, not over beef tongue and jelly trifles, but the outdoor privy is a daily dread. Because while the Victorians had steam engines, daguerreotypes, and rigid etiquette for how to sit, smile and stir your tea? They were far less prepared when nature called after dark. It's evening now and you're staying at your aunt's country estate, the kind with ivy-covered walls and footmen who always appear to be silently judging your boots. Dinner is winding down and candlelight flickers across silver spoons. But behind your polite nodding and murmured conversation, there's a growing urgency you simply cannot ignore. Unfortunately, your options are rustic, the household outhouse called the necessary by those too refined to say anything. Cruder sits about 30 yards beyond the scullery, just past the tool shed. It's a squat brick structure with a slate roof, ivy clinging to the back, and spiders in the corners so large they deserve names and pensions. You wrap yourself in a shawl and brace against the chill as you make your way across the lawn. The grass is damp. Your slippers are damp. Your spirits? Also damp. Inside, the privy is better than most. A wooden seat, a tin of ash nearby, and, most luxuriously, a small oil lamp in a glass sconce. You light it carefully, avoiding the splatter of moths, and settle in. Now comes the real trouble. What to wipe with when it's freezing and everything's slightly damp. You fumble for the cloths, a stack of linen squares cut from worn-out pillowcases. Some are cleaner than others. You pick the least offensive, give it a cautious sniff, and sigh with resignation. At least it's soft. Historians still argue whether cloth was regularly laundered between uses or simply left to dry and air clean. Some suggest that ash or lime was sprinkled between cloths to cut odor and kill bacteria. Others believe certain households reused cloths across multiple days, rotated by folds, marked by thread color, or simply prayed over. One quirky trick mentioned in a housemaid's guide: hanging cloths on a clothesline inside the privy like a curtain of shame fluttering in the breeze. Guests never saw it. Servants knew better than to speak of it. But wiping in an outdoor privy isn't just cold, it's also a delicate dance of balance and wardrobe. Remember, this is the Victorian era. You're not simply lifting a skirt. You're managing a full-length petticoat, a corset laced to mid-spine, drawers, open crotch if you're following fashion, and layers of muslin, wool, and stiff moral judgment. You're essentially performing gymnastics in a wooden box by lamplight while trying not to sit on a spider. Still you manage. You fold the cloth carefully, as you've been taught, and drop it into the lidded basket to be dealt with later. The air is sharp with the scent of lye soap and cold wood. And then comes the scariest part. The walk back. Every creak of the hedge sounds like a vagrant. Every gust of wind threatens to extinguish your lamp. And heaven help you if the night watchman sees your silhouette through the frost, Miss Eleanor wandering about with a chamber cloth. Scandalous. You step back into the house like nothing happened. Your cheeks are pink, your shawl askew, and your soul mildly shaken, but no one notices. Or if they do, they're too Victorian to comment. One final thought as you ascend the stairs. The rich may have had many luxuries, lace, carriages, even servants to warm their slippers. But when it came to the night privy, everyone was equally cold, equally rushed, and equally relieved to get back inside. Back in your room, you light a candle and ease out of your stays, sighing as your ribs return to their natural shape. But something's still bugging you. Not the corset. Not the drafts. No, it's that stiff square of yesterday's news you used out there. And so tonight we arrive at the Victorian era's most versatile, most reluctantly celebrated wiping material. Newspaper. You sit at your dressing table beside a vase of withering camellias and a small porcelain dish holding hairpins. At the back of the table lies a stack of neatly folded papers, the Times, the Pall Mall Gazette, the Morning Chronicle, once scanned for gossip and scandal, now repurposed for the most intimate chore imaginable. Victorian newspapers were not quite the whisper-thin, glossy inserts of modern times. They were thicker, printed with lead-based ink, and not particularly gentle. But if you were middle or working class, they were everywhere. And most importantly, they were free, or close enough. You pick up a page and read about an escaped cow causing havoc near Bishopsgate. It's oddly soothing. But it also makes you wonder, why weren't people alarmed about wiping with something so inky? Historians still argue whether the lead in Victorian printing ink posed a serious health risk. Some say the quantities were too small to matter. Others believe chronic exposure, especially on delicate regions, could explain certain mysterious rashes recorded in 19th century medical notes, and yet everyone used them. Folded in neat stacks in the outhouse, skewered onto nails, hung with twine in seaside cottages. Newspaper became not just entertainment, but utility. If the day's headlines made you frown, you could at least rub them on something unpleasant. 1. Fringe practice. In some rural homes, children were taught to memorize the articles aloud before the paper was reused. If you're going to read it while you wipe, one Yorkshire grandmother allegedly said, you'd best understand it first. But even for the prim and proper, newspapers crept into daily hygiene. Servants were tasked with trimming them into squares, removing sharp corners, and stacking them behind the privy door. It was considered the scrap basket's final service. As you gently separate a sheet for tomorrow's necessity, you notice something else. These pages are stiff and crinkly, but surprisingly satisfying to fold. There's a rhythm to it. 1, 2, 3 creases, like folding napkins for a dinner party, if napkins were destined for a far more ignoble fate. And it's not just homes. Even railway stations and public houses stocked newspaper in their public facilities. Some clever owners would even stamp their pub name across the top, as if to say, enjoy your visit, take a little piece of us with you. You tuck the folded squares beside the wash basin and blow out the candle. Outside, a dog barks in the distance. You slide beneath your heavy quilt and smile at the absurdity of it all. High society, strict manners, and at the end of the day, everyone wiping with old news about a pig race, and maybe that's the charm of it. In an era obsessed with refinement, newspaper reminded everyone that some things just weren't meant to be fancy. It's morning now. Sunlight creeps through lace curtains, warming the edges of the room just enough to coax you from under your blanket. As you sit up and stretch, you glance toward the corner washstand. Porcelain bowl, pitcher of cool water, and next to it, a small, oddly pristine object wrapped in wax paper. You blink. Could it be? Yes, it's here, a roll of toilet paper. Actual, honest-to-goodness, perforated, purpose-made toilet paper. In this household, someone's clearly modern. Or at least, they've bought into one of the more curious inventions of the age. Welcome to the dawn of the Victorian toilet paper revolution. You cross to the washstand and carefully unwrap the roll. It's not soft, at least not by modern standards, but it's a revelation compared to yesterday's crinkly ink. The texture is stiff, fibrous, and faintly medicinal, thanks to the aloe and carbolic acid manufacturers insisted on including. You resist the urge to sniff it again. Toilet paper, as we know it, rolled, perforated, and marketed for personal hygiene, was still finding its footing in the late 1800s. In 1857, an American named Joseph Gaiety began selling Gaiety's medicated paper, claiming it could prevent hemorrhoids. Each sheet was embossed with his name, yes, every single sheet, just in case you forgot who to thank. Historians still argue whether people genuinely bought into his pitch or simply didn't want to use corn cobs anymore. Either way, uptake was slow. And in Britain? Well, by the 1870s, toilet paper rolls were becoming available, but they were still considered a luxury. Which brings us back to your roll. It's likely from the British Perforated Paper Company, established in 1880, their innovation. Sheets, joined in a continuous roll with perforations, marketed helpfully as plumber-friendly, meaning it wouldn't clog your primitive pipes, assuming you were lucky enough to have them. One fringe detail: early marketing for toilet paper was hilariously coy. Ads used euphemisms like "for delicate purposes" or "for personal refreshment." Nobody ever said "wiping," far too vulgar. A proper Victorian would rather perish than discuss their posterior outright. Still, your host clearly embraced progress. A discreet wall-mounted dispenser sits near the washroom door, its brass, glinting in the morning light. You try it out. It squeaks faintly, but the roll turns. You tear off a square. It's sturdy. But here's the catch: it doesn't flush. Not really. At least not in most homes. Plumbing was a privilege, and indoor toilets were still a novelty. So even with toilet paper, you had to be cautious. Many households kept a soiled papers bin, emptied daily by a grim-faced servant who probably questioned every life choice that led them there. You can't help but wonder, was this truly better than newspaper, or did it just feel more proper? 1. London doctor famously advised patients to sprinkle a few drops of lavender oil on their toilet paper to sweeten the privy and the conscience. Meanwhile, Queen Victoria's own household supposedly received cases of scented hygienic papers imported from France, delivered discreetly, of course. As you fold the sheet back onto the roll, you think about how strange it must have been to be part of the first generation truly transitioning from rough improvisation to designed hygiene. Imagine being told one day, "You don't have to wipe with clippings anymore. We've got something just for that." It would have sounded ridiculous, even scandalous, and yet practical. And in that quiet moment, standing in your slippers beside the washstand, you can't help but feel it too. For all its stiff texture and peculiar scent, this early toilet paper is a tiny miracle of modernity. You're dressed now, every layer in place. Corset laced, petticoat smoothed, skirt buttoned, and blouse pinned high at the neck. Your reflection in the mirror is one of polished Victorian femininity. But all that polish comes with a very practical problem. How on earth do you go to the toilet in all this? Let's talk about the logistical nightmare that was ladies' fashion and bodily functions. Your dress this morning is modest by fashionable standards, no bustle, thankfully, and your crinoline isn't as wide as Queen Alexandra's parade attire. Still, between the layers of linen and whalebone, it's a production to so much as sit down, let alone wipe. Victorian ladies wore open-crotch drawers, a style that feels both shockingly daring and oddly utilitarian. There were no buttons, no ties, and no seams where you might expect them. This wasn't about ventilation. It was a workaround for the 5 to 7 layers you couldn't easily remove. So when nature calls, you don't undress, you hover. You lift your skirts with one hand, or ideally two, if you're lucky enough to have a nearby hook or maid. You bend slightly, shift fabric forward or back, and aim carefully over the privy or chamber pot. Then comes the tricky part: wiping. Historians still argue whether the open drawer method actually made wiping easier or just delayed the inevitable moment of fabric meets failure. Some journals mention specially designed cloths attached to ribbons, used for wiping and then discreetly tucked away. Others describe small pouches sewn into corsets for feminine linens, essentially early hygiene kits, Victorian edition. You remember a story your great-aunt told once, over tea and scandal sheets, about a woman who lost her balance in an outhouse because her bustle got wedged against the wall. The result? A toppled lady, a split skirt, and a lifelong hatred of petticoats. It was whispered about for years. One particularly quirky solution, the lady's toilet cloak, worn like an apron backwards and fastened only at the shoulders. When used, it provided modesty from behind and, conveniently, kept layers out of the way. Fashion historians debate whether this was widespread or just one of those weird inventions sold in back pages of catalogues next to liver pills and corset expanders. And then there's the matter of scent. Wiping, whether with cloth, newspaper, or the newfangled hygienic sheets, was never 100% effective. Combine that with wool undergarments, limited washing, and the Victorian resistance to bathing too often. They feared it weakened the constitution, and you get lingering aroma. To counter this, women carried scented sachets or used toilet vinegar, a mixture of herbs and diluted vinegar applied to handkerchiefs or petticoats. Lavender was the favorite. Rose water for the bold. You shift uncomfortably in your tightly laced waist, and as you ease into the drawing room for morning tea, you feel acutely aware that every woman here has performed this same awkward dance, lifting, aiming, folding, patting, and pretending it never happened. You sit with poise. You sip your Earl Grey, and you smile faintly at the absurdity of an era where wiping one's bottom was not just a necessity, it was an act of silent choreography performed under layers of linen, lace, and societal denial. Later that afternoon, as the house settles into its quiet post-luncheon lull, you retreat to your bedroom for a moment of privacy. Not for a nap, not quite. It's time for a little ritual nearly every Victorian woman knows well. A quick visit to the chamber pot. Yes, that unsung hero of the era, the chamber pot, tucked modestly beneath nearly every bed or concealed behind the pleats of a washstand skirt. You bend down, lift the curtain, and there it is, round, porcelain, faintly floral, and slightly too warm from sitting in the sunbeam that's been creeping across your bedroom floor. Using the pot isn't glamorous. It's not even particularly convenient. But when the alternative is another trip across damp garden paths to the chilly outhouse, well, you crouch. The chamber pot, known colloquially as a jerry, thunder mug, or bordeloo, if you were feeling French, and dainty boutique, was not just for nighttime emergencies. Many women preferred it for daytime use too, especially when laced into corsets that made sprinting outdoors complicated. Historians still argue whether chamber pots were emptied after every use or left to accumulate over the day, at least for those who lived alone or whose servants were already overwhelmed with coal fires, starching, and scandal control. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. In polite homes, the pot was discreetly covered with a cloth and taken away after breakfast. In boarding houses, it might sit for hours, gently fermenting like an unwelcome side project. You grip the washstand for balance as you hover, skirts lifted and patience wearing thin. Afterward, you reach for the cloth square hanging on a peg nearby, cut from old nightshirts. It's soft enough, but fraying at the corners. A simple fold, a quick pat, and you drop it into the wicker bin beneath the bed. Now comes the servant's role. That same cloth will be retrieved, without comment of course, washed, boiled, dried, folded, and placed right back on your peg tomorrow. It's a cycle of quiet labor most never think about. But for the maid, it's part of a dozen invisible tasks done daily to maintain the illusion of effortless gentility. One fringe tidbit: some upper-class ladies kept matching porcelain chamber sets complete with a wash basin, ewer, covered chamber pot, and sometimes even a coordinating slop jar. A proper set could cost more than a month's wages for a factory girl. There's something almost comically formal about it, using a hand-painted, gold-rimmed pot to do your business, only to nod primly at the maid afterward and pretend it never happened. But it's also honest. There's no pretense about what the chamber pot is for. It's right there, its presence normalized by lace curtains and china patterns. You pause before covering it again. For a moment you consider how many people across time must have performed this same quiet act: folded cloth, lowered lids, tightened sashes, and wondered if there might someday be a better way. And then, as footsteps echo down the hallway and tea trays clink somewhere downstairs, you slip the curtain closed and step away. The pot waits patiently for its next performance. It's nearly dusk, and the golden haze of afternoon has mellowed into a softer, pinkish glow. Downstairs, supper is being prepared: roast pigeon, creamed turnips, and the ever-present boiled sweet pudding. But you've slipped away, drawn by curiosity, to an unused upstairs room where a forgotten artifact rests beneath a dustcloth, a commode chair. You lift the cover gently, revealing what looks like a mahogany armchair. Elegant, polished, perhaps a bit imposing. But beneath the seat, concealed by a hinged panel, lies the truth: a padded hole and a porcelain chamber pot nestled snugly in its wooden cradle. Yes, long before indoor plumbing became a household dream, some Victorians used what was essentially a toilet-throne hybrid designed to make the act of relieving oneself feel as dignified as possible. Think of it as the precursor to the modern bathroom, minus the plumbing, privacy, or flushing. You lower yourself gently into the chair just to try it out. It's surprisingly comfortable. The armrests are curved just so, the height precise. It was made for daily use, not merely tolerated, but integrated into the rhythm of life. These commode chairs were often kept in bedrooms or dressing rooms for convenience. And while you imagine them being used mostly by the elderly or infirm, they were also a staple for women in confinement, the polite term for late-stage pregnancy and post-childbirth recovery, where going downstairs was unthinkable and squatting was a hazard. Historians still argue whether commodes were actually used with any frequency by the upper crust, or if they were more for show, a sort of status symbol for those who wanted to appear modern but still preferred the outdoor privy for its fresh air and solid acoustics. Some claim Queen Victoria herself had one in every royal residence, discreetly tucked behind velvet curtains. And here's the quirk: commodes weren't just for urination. The chamber pot could accommodate solid waste, which meant someone, always a maid, had to remove it, clean it, and reset the chair for future use. The pot itself was sometimes lined with paper, moss, or a sprinkle of ash to manage odor. You spot a small drawer in the commode's base. Inside, folded cloths, a corked bottle of scented vinegar, and a half-used bar of carbolic soap. It's a hygiene kit from a more awkward time, thoughtful, if not entirely comforting. Some wealthier households even employed a commode maid, distinct from the general maid, whose entire duty revolved around emptying, sanitizing, and managing these chairs. A job few envied, but many relied on. One fringe detail that makes you smile. Some ladies had their commode chairs disguised so cleverly that visitors might sit down on them during polite conversation, none the wiser that beneath the embroidered cushion lay a hidden loo. That's Victorian discretion for you. As the scent of roasted meat wafts through the corridor, you rise from the chair and gently replace the cloth cover. This piece of furniture, both absurd and intimate, tells you more about the era than any etiquette manual could, because for all their fuss over forks and formalities, Victorians still had to sit, wipe, and deal with it just like you. Evening has truly settled in now. Oil lamps flicker to life in the hallway, casting long, gentle shadows on the wallpaper. You drift through the house like a ghost, following the soft clinks of dishes and the rustling of skirts until you find yourself in a smaller, humbler part of the house, the servants' wing. Here, things are simpler. The wallpaper is faded, the floors creak more honestly, and the wash basins are made of tin instead of porcelain. And it's here that you discover a very different kind of toilet, the earth closet. Ah yes, not quite an outhouse, not quite a chamber pot, and definitely not yet a flush toilet. You step into a tiny room tucked behind a narrow door, and behold the contraption, a wooden bench with a hole, much like you've seen before, but with a curious lever and a bin of fine, dry earth sitting nearby. The earth closet was an innovation of the mid-Victorian period, particularly after its popularization in the 1860s by a certain Reverend Henry Moore. He proposed a cleaner, more sanitary system for managing human waste. After each use, simply pull the lever to release a scoop of dry soil onto the deposit below. No water, no smell, and theoretically, no scandal. You sit down, again, just for the sake of research, of course, and test the lever. A soft sprinkle of earth falls into the chamber below. It's strangely satisfying, like seasoning a very unfortunate casserole. Historians still argue whether the earth closet ever truly caught on outside country houses and experimental institutions. Some praised it for its simplicity and eco-friendliness. Others complained that without the right kind of soil, or if the mechanism jammed, it could turn into a very literal mess. But for many working-class households and rural estates, this was a game-changer. It allowed indoor toileting without the need for plumbing or chamber pot disposal. And better still, it was quiet. No flushing. No awkward splashes. Just the gentle rustle of dirt. One quirky tidbit. Some earth closets came with scenting powder, made of crushed flowers or dried herbs, which could be sprinkled in to add a floral note. Lavender was the usual suspect, though one eccentric noble reportedly used ground nutmeg, insisting it gave his privy the air of a bakery. You notice that even here a small bundle of wiping cloths sits folded on a nearby shelf. No paper, no frills, just soft rags clearly washed and reused again and again. A laundry basket in the corner tells you they're boiled daily, maybe with lye or soda ash, then dried on the line alongside aprons and socks, and you can't help but admire it, in a way. The practicality, the balance between privacy and necessity, the quiet dignity of people making do with earth, with cloth, with systems designed not to impress, but to function. You pull the door closed behind you, returning to the softly glowing corridor. Somewhere a maid is stoking a fire, somewhere else someone's pouring tea, and here you are a little wiser about the underside of Victorian life, because, whether in a velvet-draped boudoir or a creaky servants' hall, one truth remains. Everybody poops, and in the Victorian era, they just did it a bit more discreetly. You descend the back staircase now, its banister slightly worn from decades of gloved hands. At the base of the stairs, a door creaks open to a cold stone corridor, the kind of place that always smells faintly of coal dust and boiled cabbage. You're heading toward the scullery, but your curiosity draws you instead to the small, detached brick building out back. Yes, it's time to pay a visit to that most infamous of Victorian institutions, the privy. Outside, the evening chill sharpens. You cross the small garden, skirts rustling, breath visible in the cool air. A few chickens cluck disapprovingly as you lift the latch and step into the small wooden structure. It's dark, but dry. Inside, there's a bench with a round cutout, a modest vent above, and a telltale stack of, well, not toilet paper, moss, leaves, newsprint, and a small tin of ashes. Welcome to the rural Victorian outhouse. You crouch, grateful for the flickering lantern hanging from a hook. The scent is surprisingly bearable: wood smoke, damp soil, and the unmistakable tang of ammonia. Someone clearly tossed lime or ash in here earlier today. Good call. Historians still argue whether privies were cleaned regularly in working-class neighborhoods or only when the smell became unbearable. In truth, the answer probably depended on who was doing the cleaning, how close the neighbors lived, and whether there were pigs nearby to blame the odor on. Now you reach for your wiping material. It's a scrap of yesterday's paper. The headline reads, "Improved corset technology to rescue women's spines." Comforting. The ink smudges faintly onto your fingers. Not ideal. One fringe detail. In some communities, people used wool clippings, corn husks, or even seashells as wiping tools. A rough life, literally. But in coastal towns, those shells were common and, supposedly, quite efficient once you got used to them. You shudder a little. You test the bench, noting the slight give in the boards beneath you. A spider scuttles away. It's not glamorous, it's not elegant, but it's undeniably authentic. Behind you, mounted at eye level, is a small shelf holding a bottle labeled Privy Tonic. You open it cautiously. The scent of camphor and rosemary punches your nose. It was meant to be sprinkled into the hole after each use. Part odor control, part Victorian optimism. It's easy to imagine entire families sharing a single privy like this one, trudging out at night with a lantern, careful not to wake the chickens or step in anything regrettable. Even the wealthy often preferred outdoor privies over the newer indoor toilets. They feared that water closets might leak, smell, or explode. Yes, early plumbing was famously unpredictable. You glance out the open door at the creeping twilight. The garden rustles. A cat flickers past. In this moment it strikes you just how common this all once was. How utterly normal. This wasn't a side note in history. It was a daily ritual, a private moment in a very public era. Everyone, lords, ladies, stable boys, and schoolmarms, eventually made their way to the outhouse, and with one last shake of the newspaper scrap, you stand, smooth your skirts, and step back into the chilly dusk, leaving behind a little wooden box full of whispered stories and barely repressed discomfort. You head back inside, cheeks tingling from the crisp night air, and find the warmth of the kitchen a welcome change. The cook glances at you briefly, her hands deep in a bowl of suet crust, and you nod politely before making your way to a quieter corner, where an odd contraption rests on a low shelf beside the pantry door. It's an unassuming wooden box with a hinged lid, painted a dull cream. Curious, you open it. Inside, folded squares of medicated toilet paper. That's right, paper. Real, actual toilet paper. Sort of. In the latter half of the Victorian era, a new wonder product began appearing in chemists' shops and catalogues. Medicated paper for the water closet, often sold in boxed sheets or rolls. You pick one up, it's stiff, coarse, and smells faintly of carbolic acid. Comfort clearly wasn't the primary design goal. Historians still argue whether this paper was seen as a luxury, a necessity, or a gimmick. Some sources claim it was marketed more for its antiseptic properties than for wiping efficiency. In other words, better for your health, not necessarily your backside. The first commercial toilet paper in Britain was sold under names like Germicide, Bronco, and yes, medicated paper for delicate skins. Despite the promising names, the reality was far from cloud soft. Many joked that the early paper sheets were better suited for writing letters than cleaning oneself. And then there was the packaging. You remember the old advertisements, elegant fonts, delicate illustrations of roses and cherubs, placed next to phrases like removes offensive matter and cleansing without chafing. It's hard not to laugh. The Victorians had a knack for dressing even the most unmentionable things in flowery language. One fringe tidbit: toilet paper sheets were sometimes perforated with poems, cheeky little verses about hygiene, modesty, and moral cleanliness. A few were religious in tone too, because apparently nothing says repent like rhymed couplets on a wiping square. You place the paper back into its box, unsure whether to feel grateful or vaguely concerned. Nearby sits a tin labelled toilet paper alternative, hemp toweling wipes. Another reminder that paper wasn't universally accepted. In fact, some older family members swore off the newfangled stuff altogether, insisting that cloth, moss, or even sponge on a handle felt more civilized. And yes, sponges. Some households kept a shared sponge, soaking in vinegar or salt water to be used communally and rinsed after each use. You take a moment to really sit with that image, and then promptly decide not to. You hear a clock strike the hour. 8 o'clock, and imagine someone else, somewhere in this city, reaching into a similar box and pulling out a square of carbolic-scented paper. They'll wince, perhaps, or sigh, or simply go about their business as generations had before them. Because no matter how innovative or itchy, these little paper squares mark a turning point. The beginning of a shift, a preview of modernity. And for just a moment, as you run your fingers across the embossed pattern on the lid, you feel oddly connected to everyone who's ever faced the same question. How exactly do I clean up after myself and move on with my day? The fire in the parlor crackles gently now, casting soft shadows across the carpet as you settle into a high-backed chair with a teacup balanced on one knee. Outside, gas lamps glow faintly through the lace curtains, and the house has grown quieter, sleepier. It's the perfect time to reflect, not just on what people used to wipe with, but why they wiped the way they did. Because in the Victorian era, cleanliness was more than just a matter of comfort. It was a moral imperative. You sip your tea and leaf through a dog-eared etiquette manual left on the side table. Among its many rules, how to receive a calling card, which fork to use for oysters, you find a chapter titled Personal Sanitary Conduct. It dances around the topic, of course. No one in 1870 was going to say buttocks in polite print, but between the lines it's clear how you cleaned yourself was considered a reflection of your character. Historians still argue whether Victorians were genuinely obsessed with hygiene or just liked pretending they were. The truth likely lies in their tension between appearance and practicality. Cleanliness suggested discipline, self-respect, and social superiority. Dirty fingernails might mean you were poor, or worse, morally lax. This belief filtered down even into toilet habits. The idea of simply wiping and walking away was insufficient. You were expected to refresh, scent, powder, maybe even apply rose water. Some women carried small bottles of cologne in their reticules, specifically for post-privy touch-ups. It wasn't just about being clean, It was about being dainty. One quirky tidbit: wealthier households sometimes employed toilet water atomizers, early versions of spray bottles that dispensed rose-scented mist meant to neutralize odors after doing your business. It's the 19th century version of courtesy flush, minus the flush. And then there's the matter of class. For the upper crust, wiping was only part of a ritualized process involving scented cloths, powder puffs, and even toilet servants. Yes, some truly posh households employed someone specifically to draw baths, heat wiping cloths, and manage the personal hygiene accessories of the master or mistress. You try not to picture the job interview. For the working class, though, the experience was very different. No atomizers, no soft linen cloths, often not even privacy. In crowded urban tenements, families might share a single privy at the end of the alley, the queue marked not by a rope but by sheer unspoken patience. And wiping? Whatever you had on hand, newspaper, rags, cabbage leaves, even a particularly well-worn sock. It's here, in this juxtaposition, that the Victorian era reveals itself most honestly, a society striving for impossible standards, building lace around a latrine, and insisting that even elimination could be elegant, provided you had the means. You close the etiquette manual with a soft thud, letting your eyes drift toward the fire. For all their prudishness, Victorians spent an astonishing amount of time thinking about what we now flush and forget, and in doing so they left behind a trail of inventions, contradictions, and curiosities. One wiping habit at a time. You shift in your chair, not unlike someone on a wooden privy bench trying to get comfortable, and smile. Even in history, the most human things are often the most hidden. The coals have dimmed now to a gentle red glow, and the clock ticks steadily in the hallway. You're almost surprised the night hasn't ended already, but there's still one room left to explore, one door you haven't yet opened. And it creaks softly as you push it in. The water closet. Yes, the true precursor to the modern toilet. A gleaming marvel, if you're lucky, or a clanking, temperamental beast, if you're not. Inside the small, tiled space, there's a wooden seat with a high-backed tank mounted on the wall above. A long, dangling chain invites you to pull. You don't yet, but it's tempting. This contraption is the mid-Victorian flush toilet, also known as the water closet, or simply WC. It was still quite rare in the average home in the 1850s, 1870s, but by the end of the century, it had become a symbol of progress. One mainstream historical fact: by 1851, during the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace, flush toilets were on full public display. In fact, over 800,000 visitors used them. Yes, even back then, the line for the bathroom was part of the experience. You finally pull the chain. A great gurgle erupts from above as water surges down into the bowl. It's oddly theatrical, like applause for your hypothetical success. Historians still argue whether early flush toilets were actually cleaner than the alternatives. Some critics claimed they merely moved the smell from one place to another. Others pointed out that without proper plumbing infrastructure, they frequently leaked, backfired, or just sat idle like expensive furniture. And speaking of expense, only the very wealthy could afford them in the early days. Installing a WC meant not just buying the unit, but retrofitting the house with iron piping, cisterns, and a connection to an emerging and inconsistent sewer network. One quirky fringe tidbit: early adopters often placed rugs and armchairs in their water closets to make them feel less like latrines and more like private reading nooks. The idea of curling up with a Dickens novel beside your flush toilet? That was luxury. But wiping? Still primitive. Toilet paper was only just appearing in boxed sheets and hadn't yet been universally accepted. Some WC owners kept a small stack of cut muslin cloths beside the tank. Others used folded paper, cotton batting, or even wool wadding. A few experimental souls tried sponges on sticks, left soaking in vinegar between uses, though you suspect those didn't last long in polite society. You examine a nearby shelf and find exactly what you hoped for: a small jar labelled Arsene's Patent Lavender Toilet Wipes. Inside are stiff little folded cloths that smell vaguely like soap and regret, not soft, not even absorbent, but patent and therefore trusted. Above the tank, a notice is tacked to the wall in lovely script. Please pull once only. Excess. Waste may cause overflow. You pause. This is probably not the place for optimism. Even among the elite, water closets weren't always kept indoors. Some were installed in separate annexes or even disguised garden rooms, all to keep the sound and scent away from the living quarters. Heaven forbid a dinner guest hears something unsavory through the wall. And yet, for all their quirks, water closets signaled a turning point. They represented a belief that waste could be hidden, managed, and ultimately civilized. You close the lid gently, step back, and exhale. You've seen the wiping habits of Victorian society, from chamber pot to carbolic paper to this, an early glimpse of the modern bathroom. Progress, perhaps, but still messy, awkward, and deeply human. You leave the water closet behind, walking now through narrower halls where the carpet grows threadbare and the wallpaper peels just slightly at the seams. The laughter and clinking glasses from the drawing room have faded. The household has begun winding down for the night, but you, ever curious, head upward toward the attic rooms. Here the air is cooler. The floorboards creak more loudly, like they're complaining, and behind one crooked door you find a cramped little space with a low bed, a wash basin, and an object that instantly catches your eye. It's a commode chair, a kind of disguised toilet hidden inside a wooden armchair. You lift the cushioned seat and find a porcelain chamber pot tucked neatly inside. This, it turns out, was the nighttime solution for people who couldn't or wouldn't trudge to the privy after dark. One mainstream fact: these chairs were incredibly common among the elderly, the infirm, and, interestingly, ladies of means who preferred not to wander the halls at night. They came in all styles, from humble pine to ornately carved mahogany. Some even matched bedroom furniture sets because, of course, even your toilet needed to be fashionable. You imagine a lady sitting here by lamplight, reading by candle, while attending to nature. Perhaps her maid had warmed the pot with hot water in winter, or sprinkled rose petals on the rim. Romantic? Maybe. Practical? Just barely. Wiping material here would have been tucked into a side drawer or left neatly folded in a decorative basket. Cloths, flannel squares, if very lucky, a few sheets of medicated paper. One quirky tidbit: some wealthier households kept a warming stone beneath the chamber pot, essentially a large hot brick, so the porcelain wouldn't feel icy on contact. Victorian comfort in its oddest form. You settle briefly into the chair, appreciating the logic. No stairs, no cold walk, no splashing lime into a pit. Just sit and go, and then perhaps ring the bell in the morning for your chambermaid to discreetly whisk the pot away for cleaning. You mentally apologize to the maid. Historians still argue whether these chairs were used nightly or only when illness struck. Some diaries mention them as occasional conveniences, others imply they were indispensable parts of the evening routine. The thought lingers as you examine the washstand: a pitcher of water, a sliver of lavender soap, and a neatly folded linen. towel embroidered with initials long forgotten. Here, even the humblest routines are touched with a sense of ceremony. And it's in this quiet room, with its sloping ceiling and scent of old wood, that you realize how layered Victorian life really was. Toilets weren't just about function. They were about position, privacy, and propriety. Downstairs, a gentleman might use a water closet with brass fixtures. In the servants' quarters, a shared privy. But here in the attic, a disguised chair with a secret bowl. One house, 3 methods. A class system written in porcelain and pine. You close the lid gently and rise, stepping back into the corridor. The candle flickers. The night deepens. And in the hush that follows, it's hard not to marvel at just how inventive, impractical, and oddly beautiful the human solution to a universal problem can be. Your candle burns lower now, casting long amber shadows on the corridor walls as you descend one last flight of stairs, this time to the servants' level beneath the grand home. The air here is heavier, laced with coal smoke, boiled starch, and the faint, ever-present tang of wet boots drying by the hearth. You follow the hallway to a thick wooden door with a simple bolt. Beyond it, a cramped, bricked chamber, dimly lit and barely ventilated. No polished mahogany chairs or lavender-scented wipes here, just a wooden bench with a round hole, a bucket beneath it, and a stack of, well, it could generously be called used rags. This is the night closet, or sometimes called the slop closet. And it was the reality for the vast majority of domestic staff. One mainstream historical fact. While water closets were gaining popularity among the wealthy by the late Victorian era, most working-class homes and servant quarters still relied on chamber pots or night closets like this one, emptied each morning into backyard cesspits or municipal waste carts known as night soil wagons. And night soil wasn't just a euphemism, it was an occupation. Men, often desperately poor, were hired to empty privies and carry the waste out of town. They worked by lantern light, ankle-deep in sludge, and were paid by the bucket. Historians still argue whether the job was a punishment, a necessity, or a kind of grim community service. Probably all 3. You crouch beside the bucket now and examine the pile of cloths. They're stiff, threadbare. Likely repurposed shirt sleeves or old dish towels torn into squares. Each one used, rinsed in the scullery, and used again. No antiseptic. No soap, most nights. Just cold water and a bit of hope. A quirky fringe tidbit. Some maids reportedly used pages from expired almanacs or cookbooks not because they were plentiful, but because they felt the written word, especially one bearing Queen Victoria's crest, added a touch of dignity to the indignity. You look up and spot a hook on the wall, likely once used to hang a lantern or bundle of clean rags. The ceiling is low, the floor is packed dirt, and yet this small space played a pivotal part in daily Victorian life, just never one they discussed over tea. Because in every grand house were layers. Upstairs, velvet curtains, finger sandwiches, and perfumed water closets. Down here, cracked, pails, soot, black fingernails, and the knowledge that no matter how invisible your work was, you still had to go and you still had to clean up afterward. You sit briefly on the wooden bench, letting the moment settle. The rough grain of the seat, the silence of the stone walls. There's no judgment here, no pretension. Just the basic, human routine that binds every era together across all classes. It's humbling, oddly comforting, and maybe, in its own way, the most honest room in the house. You close the door to the night closet softly behind you, letting its latch click into place. The house now is completely still, as if it's holding its breath. Only the occasional groan of old timber or the distant whisper of wind under eaves reminds you that time still moves forward, even here, even now. With slow steps, you return to the parlour. The embers have cooled into glowing marbles of orange. Your teacup sits empty. And for the first time all evening, you sit not to explore, but simply to reflect. You've journeyed from garden privies to chamber pots, from carbolic wipes to commode, chairs, and down into the grimy corners of servant life. What began as a simple question, how did Victorians wipe their butts, has quietly unfolded into something far more human. A mainstream historical fact now lingers in your thoughts. By the very end of the 19th century, toilet paper rolls had finally entered mass production in England. The familiar perforated sheets we know today began to spread, not just in pharmacies, but in households, in schools, in railway stations. It was the soft revolution no one dared talk about. But before that, it was all trial and error. Cloths soaked in vinegar, corn husks in the countryside, newspaper in city slums, sponges passed between hands, rinsed and reused, and with each method, 1,000 untold decisions: who cleans what, who buys what, who bears the discomfort in silence. A quirky tidbit: Queen Victoria herself is rumoured, though unconfirmed, to have had a custom bidet imported from France. More sculpture than seat, it was built into a mahogany cabinet and lined with soft sponge and silver fixtures. Some say it was heated, others insist it was perfumed with lilac. Historians still argue whether it was ever used, which brings you, oddly, back to the same truth. For all their sophistication and innovation, Victorians were just people with preferences, habits and bodies that did what bodies do. And it's that humanity you carry with you now into the slow softness of this night. So here you are. The embers have faded to ash, and the candle beside you has melted into a puddle of warm wax. All around, the house breathes quietly in sleep, its walls holding stories not written in books, but whispered in gestures, in habits, in little daily decisions. You've wandered through a century tonight, not in battles or great inventions, but through wash basins and folded rags, through rosewater and rickety benches. You've followed the most private routines of people long gone, whose names are forgotten but whose habits were not so different from your own. And maybe that's the gentlest kind of history, the kind that doesn't shout but rustles like linen